correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Welcome to Me and Steve Talk RPGs, a podcast where me and my friend Steve try and help you get the most out of your role-playing game experience. What's up, Gamer Nation? Welcome back to Me and Steve, and tonight, well, there's just one Steve because the kind folks at the other Steve's internet provider decided that they needed to shut him down for a couple hours. So, because there's only one of me, and, well, I will talk to myself for hours on end, and no one really wants to hear the ramblings inside my head. So I got the wonderful JT Dimino, who's from Primed by Cortex and does a whole bunch of stuff with the D20 network, to come join me on the show. And we'd actually planned to have him on before Steve had his internet issues, and we were going to talk about Fate. So, JT, hello, and welcome to Me and Steve.
Hey, thanks for having me, Steve. I mean, if it makes you feel better, you can also call me Steve or Fake Steve or something. Just,
Well, I've been joking that I'm going to start calling you and your co-host both KT.
Yeah, well, I mean, we practically are the same person already, so, that's just step in the right direction there.
He said the same thing when we had him on a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he's great, and I'm really jealous that you guys got to talk to him without me. But now we're making up for that tonight, so there you go.
Yes, exactly. So I guess first off, yeah, obviously, like I mentioned, you're one of the hosts of the Prime by Cortex podcast. If you wanted to talk about that a little bit, just let the people know in case they missed the episode we did with Kirby, what your show's all about.
Yeah, sure. So, Prime by Cortex podcast. We're an unofficial podcast, I guess I should say, but we're basically talking all about the Cortex Prime system, which is a generic modular type of system. The rule set has been used in different iterations before for previous games like Marvel Heroic, Firefly, Smallville. So there's just been a lot of different big IPs associated with it before. And now for the first time, it's out in like a fully generic and modular form. So yeah, most of our episodes, we either are interviewing someone who is involved, either like officially on the staff with like fandom or someone for developing for Cortex, or we also interview fans and other Cortex creators who are doing their own things with the system, which is also really cool. And soon they'll be able to actually put those up for download and even selling once fandom rolls out their system for that. So that'll be pretty cool. And hopefully we'll get to talk to a lot more people once that goes up.
Yeah. No, and I know some people who are pretty excited about Cortex and are waiting, well, perhaps rather impatiently for the community content posting, whatever you want to call it, to get up and running and the digital tool.
Yeah, those digital tools they really look neat from what I've seen demoed. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be like a full suite, and pretty much anything you want to do that involves Cortex, you'll be able to handle online pretty much. They'll have dice rollers. You'll be able to make your modular character sheets there. I know you talked to Kirby a bit about that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, we're just having a good time and just letting people get excited about Cortex. They've got some pretty cool games coming out in the near future, like Tales of Exadia for the Dragon Prince.
Right.
And then they've also got Legends of Grayskull, yeah, for He-Man and associated characters and universes.
Yeah. See, Cortex seems like a really intriguing system to me. I mean,
I would definitely say so.
Yeah, like I've started reading it, and my problem is that I've started reading, I think I've got 6 different RPG core books that I've started reading in the last 2 months.
Oh, I know how that goes, man. Let me tell you. I feel like I've got this huge collection of things that I still haven't read, and I don't know when I'm going to get to them. But until then, I like to joke that sort of like I'm not really like an RPG player. I'm more of an RPG collector. So, I haven't even gotten a chance to play like half of the things on my shelf, but I'm still buying new stuff all the time. So.
Oh, I'm in the same boat. I still have a collection. Actually, it's sitting about arm's length from me right now. A stack of Palladium Riffs books about a foot
Oh
tall.
man, old school.
Yeah, yeah, and you know what? It's a beautiful world, but wow, has time not been kind to that system.
Yeah, I've never gotten to play the Palladium version, but I did get to try out the Savage Worlds version, and that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
I would think that the Savage Worlds stuff kind of made it flow more smoothly than it did with what I've heard about the Palladium system. So,
Well, Palladium, I've said I don't think it played badly. The problem was getting to playing because
Mm.
even experienced people in the system, to just get the stats on the sheet, you're looking at the fastest I ever knew anyone to do it was 45 minutes.
Oof.
And that was at the time, I mean, I was pretty deep into it and I was looking at probably an hour 15.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty intense. And I've also heard there was a lot of power creep as time went on with like new supplements and stuff like that, where it just kind of got ridiculous to like balance things out.
That is an understatement. Rifts is the definition of power creep.
Well, there you go.
And
But
this coming
yeah,
from someone who is a fan. I will say that. I'm just not a fan of the way Palladium does things anymore.
yeah, sure, sure.
As an adult, I don't have time to dedicate that much time to any one system unless it's the only thing I wanna play.
Yeah, yeah. I can usually only handle like one campaign at a time or maybe two, but like I beyond that, it would be too overwhelming for me with my schedule right now. So
Yeah. Yes, but in any case, all that conversation being said, the reason we actually brought you on
yeah.
today was not to talk about Cortex, but to talk about a different game, which, at least was my understanding, had at least at one point for a short time a podcast about, which is the Fate system.
Hey, what's that? Just kidding. But yeah, no, you're right. I actually did a podcast. We only had recorded a couple episodes, and we had so many technical issues and scheduling stuff that it just kind of like fell apart before we really got it started. But yeah, I was doing the podcast. We did one episode with Ben Erickson, and my other co-host was Robert Hans, who for people who are in the know with like the Fate community, he actually did the Book of Hans, which is sort of like a collection of posts that he did back when Google Plus was a thing. And it sort of explained the intricacies of the Fate system, particularly geared towards like newbies who are still trying to grok it because it's a very different system than a lot of people are used to. It's definitely not your like traditional like D20 type of game. So, but yeah, so he was my co-host, and it was really cool. I actually basically met him by asking him if he wanted to do a podcast on Fate with me, and we did that for a while.
Oh, wow. That's cool though in a lot of ways. I mean, yeah, though to what you were saying, I know Fate is it's different. And
Yes.
I guess it gets lumped into a lot of like the generic narrative game category with like Powered by the Apocalypse. And
Right.
I, I mean, I think it kind of does belong there, but I don't know Powered by the Apocalypse real well either, but Fate is different even than that in a lot of ways. And what I have heard of it is some people say it does, and I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb here and say I think it requires a little bit of a different approach to playing, much like if you're playing like the FFG narrative dice for Genesis or Star Wars, you have to approach it differently in your head.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with you on that. And yeah, Fate is definitely sort of like a generic narrative game. It also can be modular. I don't know, like on like a continuum, I think that Cortex is probably a little bit more modular, but Fate definitely has a lot of pieces that you can tweak and take out or put in too. So it is very good for trying to customize things to more like you like it. But I'd say that by default, it handles mostly like more of the cinematic type of narrative stuff. Like Fate basically assumes that all of your characters are sort of going to be like competent badasses from the get go.
Hmm.
And so if you want to play something that's not that, then it requires a little bit of tweaking. I sort of have this philosophy after gaming for a couple of decades now where you can pretty much try to use any system to like play any setting or whatever. It's just a matter of one, like how do you want the game to feel while you're playing it? And two, how much work do you want to have to do in order to make it work for that system, you know? So just I don't like to say that like any one system is better than another, but I would say that like certain systems lend themselves to playing certain types of games better than others.
Yeah, that I was gonna say, I was listening to what you're saying and going, "I know he's going somewhere," because 'cause I'm one of those people that well, I rail against the idea that, "Well, you can play anything with 5e." Well, technically, yes, you can, but that doesn't mean it's good for it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, again, it all comes back to sort of like what your goal is. Like, if your goal is to hack 5e to do this setting because none of your players want to learn a new system and all they know is 5e, then, that's fine. As long as everyone's cool with that, then that's cool. If you want it to feel more like the setting, potentially, you might want to consider a different system that's geared more towards whatever, the setting is about.
Mhm.
Because I found a lot of times when people try to hack 5e, it just ends up feeling like 5e with a new paint job instead of like it doesn't feel like whatever setting they're trying to play in.
Yeah. So, let me ask you
But I
something be
digress. Yeah.
well, that's okay. We tangent and go off down rabbit trails constantly on this show, so feel right at home. Um, but the one thing I've heard Fate and most of my experience with Fate has actually been listening to actual plays, and for quite a while, I was listening to a podcast out of Canada called The Terrible Warriors, and they went through a string where they were playing quite a bit of Fate, and I remember they did a Stargate adaptation of it. They did a literally drawn up on the air fantasy version of it, and then they did one that was The Cats of Gravity Falls. And so my kind of sense of Fate is that perhaps one of its bigger strengths is that it's great for pickup games and pickup settings. Is that accurate in your experience or
Yeah, yeah. I would definitely agree with that. I'd say that you could definitely do it pretty easily with pickups. They even have sort of like character creation often will get its own session when you're doing a Fate campaign, just because there's a lot of like collaborative world building that can be involved with that.
Mhm.
But they do have sort of like rules or shortcuts for how do you get people just playing in a game, and a lot of times that means that the GM will kind of come up with everything either on the spot or beforehand for the players. But yeah, you can just sort of do something and go with it. I actually ran a sort of Fate. I don't know what you call it, like Fate roulette sort of or a session one shot at Gamer Nation Con, the last Gamer Nation Con, and
Okay.
just started off right off the bat where I was like, okay, so like what sort of game do we want to play? And then it ended up being like, oh, we want to do some sort of like actiony spy type of thing. And then people brought up like monsters. So then we ended up being like this like or the party I should say ended up being this like cryptid spy mystery group that ran their own food truck on the side, but then like tried to like solve mysteries and stuff like that. It was really weird, but really wacky and fun. I think everyone really had a blast with that. But so that's just the sort of crazy things that you can do with Fate just right off the bat. I'd say that that's one of its strengths is that character creation is so open that you can really sort of model whatever type of character you want to play pretty easily.
Yeah, yeah, I got that. Like I told you, I started actually because you can download the core rules, if you will. It's a book, but it's basically almost like an SRD or system reference document, and I think it's pay what you want on drive through. But I
Yeah,
picked it
yeah.
actually, I had it a while ago, I think, and then I downloaded it again or something, I don't know. But I was reading through a little bit of the character creation, and it's kinda weird because you don't have stats, but you do.
Yeah, so the big thing about Fate are its aspects, and aspects are kind of like distinctions in Cortex, not to sort of try to draw parallels there or anything, but basically aspects tend to be like narrative descriptions. They're usually like word or phrase, usually no more than like a sentence at the most, maybe. And they
Mhm.
just sort of represent something important about your character, and they can be used basically to like give you bonuses to your rolls and stuff, but they basically sort of shape like what your character is, what's important to them, things like that. And so because the the basic framework of Fate is built around this like narrative description, you don't have to necessarily worry as much about like the various stats and powers and other things that a lot of other systems would have you working on. You can just sort of describe what's important about your character, like they are a superhero or whatever, right? And then that's all you really need to get going.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, the other thing to bear in mind is this came out in what, 2013-ish?
Yeah, that was Fate Core. Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, you're talking about a game that I'm gonna say was probably kind of ahead of its time in a lot of ways, in that regard.
Yeah, well, that was so Fate Core is sort of the most recent, like full quote unquote version of the game, and it was technically, I think, technically like the fourth edition
Oh,
of Fate
wow.
at that point. Yeah, and so I forget when exactly it started, but so technically it's like on the fourth edition, and then they recently in the last year or two came out with Fate Condensed, which is sort of like what they would call Fate 4.5. So it just took a bunch of stuff that they had learned over like the last, 6, 7 years, and they basically cut out all of the extra stuff and just kept it to like the most important things that you need to play a game of Fate as is without like changing a whole lot, I guess. But then there's still, and you're right that they're all like pay what you want on their website and on Drive Through RPG for the PDF anyway. You're gonna
Yeah.
have to pay for a hard copy, obviously. But I really do appreciate that from those guys at Evil Hat, because a lot of people I know just don't have the money to be able to like buy a new RPG every week or whatever. So being able to have something like this where you can just pay whatever you can afford, or if you just want to check it out for free, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I know Steve has a hard copy of the Dresden Files, which is
Oh yeah.
Fate rule set, but it's its own standalone game, and I'm assuming it's probably tweaked, assorted ways. But this is, like you were saying, this is, so to speak, your core book. Here's your toolbox. There is no setting involved in this Fate core that I have, but you can do anything you want to with it. And I think because it's narrative, unless you're really going for like a crunchy simulationist type game, I think it can do it. Whether it's your cup of tea, I don't know. Not saying you personally, but you know what I'm saying. Whether it's not going to scratch that itch if you like crunching numbers. But if you just want to sit around and tell a story and use dice to be your variables, I think it's a solid contender in any case.
Yeah, I mean, so I would agree that yeah, Fate. Well, Fate can get crunchy in a way, but it's not like number crunchy, I guess.
Okay.
The crunch comes in with the different elements that you sort of can add in, or their different way of doing things than like your typical like attribute skill sort of stuff. And then that
Mhm.
can get more complicated depending on how you want to run it. But yeah, just real quick, because I was like looking through my Fate stuff again just to spark my memory. But so characters and Fate, and what makes for a good Fate game, you want characters, according to the book, that are proactive, capable people leading dramatic lives. So that's sort of the default assumption for a Fate game. And so if you want to depart from that, then you're probably going to need to change some stuff up. But basically, it's made with that in mind. And a lot of the mechanics try to support that type of play by Raw. So that does lend itself well to a lot of like book series, TV shows, movies that you can think of. But you can do horror with Fate, and they actually released a supplement specifically for how to basically mod Fate to do horror. But you definitely, it doesn't really lend itself to that without any modification, I guess you could say, because it's much more about like badass people doing stuff and being dramatic.
Yeah, that's a thing, and I'll try to keep the tangent short.
Yeah,
I
no worries.
think an important aspect of horror RPGs in most cases is you actually don't want the characters to be badasses. You want them to be normal and vulnerable, because if they're a badass, there's nothing to be scared of.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, a big part of horror too, I think, is buy-in. The best
Mhm.
horror games I've ever run were with like people who are sort of like willing to put themselves and their characters into these vulnerable positions and not always trying to be the badass, always able to like fight the monster or whatever. And I've had a blast with those groups when they're able to do that, because it just really sort of solidifies the atmosphere for horror when you do that.
Yeah. I actually, and I've said this a couple times in the last couple episodes of the show. I love horror RPGs, but strangely enough, I'm not really into horror movies or books or anything like that. It's kind of a
Mm,
strange thing. But you're absolutely right in that horror gaming requires a different sort of buy-in and a different sort of approach. And you do have to have players that are willing and want to do it because it just, to me, that's half the fun. Like one of the
right.
first games I ever played any amount was Call of Cthulhu, and half the fun of Call of Cthulhu is looking at the situation from a meta perspective and going, "Oh, it'd be stupid as heck for my character to do this, but that's what they're gonna do because it actually makes sense."
Yeah. And if you want to hear more about buy-in, listen to Steve and Steve's last episode. So I
Yeah.
just thought I'd do that plug for you while I'm at it. But
Yeah, that dropped, well, as we record yesterday morning. But, yeah, before we go off and have, me and Steve parking lot conversation, let's try and go back to
yeah,
Fate.
sorry about that. I get distracted and off track easily, so
Oh,
might need to just keep me on the rails a little bit, but I'll try my best.
well, like, Steve and I joke about it, but people say we ramble on the show, and we looked at each other and go, "This is the most focused our conversations ever get." But, yeah, so, yeah, Fate, instead of stats, uses aspects, basically. Am I correct in my quick understanding of that?
So yeah, so for Fate Core, you have aspects, which are the narrative stuff, and they do actually have skills, and skills are rated generally between -2 to like +8, and it can technically go beyond. But basically, your skills will just basically be bonuses added to your dice roll. And I guess I should probably go back a bit and say that in Fate, you have what are called Fate or Fudge dice, which are named after the fudge system, which first implemented this, as far as I know. So instead of like 1 to 6 or a d20 or whatever, you've got these d6 dice that have plus and minus symbols and blink sides on it. So when you're playing Fate, you're rolling 4 of these Fate dice. And so you'll get a score between -4 and +4, with the more extreme scores being much less likely to roll than like a 0, for example. So you'll basically start with a number with -4 to +4. Then you'll add whatever bonus you get for whatever skill is involved, and you can also spend fate points to like activate an aspect that would help you in that situation, and so that can give you additional bonuses, usually a +2 from that. But and then you're up against a difficulty which is generally either opposed or determined by the GM ahead of time. And
Mhm.
so then if you beat that, then you succeed. They have something called succeed with style, which is sort of like a critical success, where you get like the success and you get some like extra mechanical thingies to go along with that success. And one of the things that's really cool about Fate that I like is that when you tie, you can either just say like, oh, it's sort of a wash, or you can allow the player to succeed at a minor cost. So, maybe they succeeded, but the minor cost could be like, oh, like you succeed, but, now you're off balance and now it's going to be easier for them, when they're coming back at you next time or something. Or
Mhm.
even if you fail in Fate, generally, and rules as written, the player does have the option to say that they want to succeed at a major cost. And, the major cost is going to be up to the GM also. Like, okay, well, if you want to succeed, then as you jump over this pit, you don't end up like falling or hanging by a thread, but you end up like dropping all of your equipment, down into the pit. And so then you made it across, but now you have, no weapons, no items or anything. And in terms of like narrative RPGs, I think that's a really cool idea, just because I've had a lot of games before where, whatever I think would be cool ends up getting canceled out by whatever the dice rolled. And that's a whole nother conversation there about like when should you roll the dice, right? But
Oh
the
gosh, yes.
idea that the story can happen exactly as you want it, because you have the option to succeed whenever you want. And I guess you could always just choose to fail too instead of rolling the dice. Like, why not, right? If you think it would be dramatically cool for your character to fail, just say, "Oh yeah, I'm just going to fail this," And but because of the narrative aspect, I really like that idea.
Mhm. Now let me ask you this, do the fate points, you were talking about how as a player you can spend them to invoke your aspect, be it, we'll say you're trying to win a tug of war contest and you happen to have the aspect strong written down. So you would spend a fate point to get a bonus on the roll associated with this tug of war contest.
That's right. Yeah.
Do those points, does that work in a pool? Like, is that a meta currency within the game, or do you just have so many to spend through the course of the game?
So it is a meta currency type of thing. Generally, you start out with 3 fate points, if I remember correctly, by default. But they give you the option during character creation where you can give your character some extra stunts in exchange for giving up one of your starting fate points. So you can do up to 2 stunts for 2 starting fate points. So you start with 1, but you always have to start with at least 1. The
Okay.
GM generally starts out with a number of fate points equal to the number of players in the group. So, like, if you
Okay.
had like 3 other people, or if you had like 3 characters in this campaign, then the GM would start out with 3 to like match the number that of players there are.
Okay.
Yeah, and you can so people spend the fate points for players, so you can invoke an aspect like we talked about. You can declare a story detail, which is it's sort of like in Genesis or FFG Star Wars, where it's kind of like, oh, did you remember to bring your gas mask or whatever for this poisonous air planet or whatever? And, oh yeah, totally, I did, and you spend the fate point, even though you never mentioned having the gas mask before. Now you do.
No, I should say I love mechanics like that because it just, I think if nothing else, it helps prevent that planning paralysis that happens so many times at the table.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I should mention that Fate did this first before FFG Star Wars and those other games. So I think that, and I may be mistaken, but I think that they were one of the first big games to really use this idea of a meta currency that can like add story details and stuff.
I love those type of things. I think they're great.
The interesting twist with Fate, though, is technically like rules as written. You're supposed to tie the story detail that you're making up into one of your aspects that you have. And I know a lot of people that either ignore that or just kind of like, hand wave it or whatever. But, so like technically, if you were going to like add the gas mask, maybe you have an aspect that's like always prepared, or maybe because, you're the ship's pilot, you make sure that you've always got the supplies you need when you're going on a flight or whatever. But so you could think of interesting narrative ways to tie that stuff in, and I thought that was an interesting twist on that.
Yeah, that is, I mean, I like that idea, but I kind of like the more freeform interpretation of it too.
Yeah, and that's why. So the golden rule of fate is basically decide what you're doing first and what that looks like, and then figure out how you want to use the rules to model it. So basically, they're saying like from the get go, don't let the rules get in the way of having a fun time and telling a good story. If the rules seem to be contrary to what you're trying to do, then just forget about the rules, do what you think is best and fun. And I think that's a really awesome sort of philosophy for a game to have.
Yeah, that's the golden rule of gaming though, and I think to
Yeah,
me
yeah.
that's what drew me to RPG games. I discovered RPG games a lot different than some people. I didn't discover RPG games till technically my freshman year of college. Like
Mm.
I kind of knew that Dungeons and Dragons existed, but I grew up in a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere where to this day I don't think you can buy a gaming book within a half an hour of that town, probably an hour. And so it just wasn't a thing there. And then, I get to college and actually the first thing I ever played was the old West End Games Star Wars.
Oh yeah, that was my first too.
And then that led to we had a big Call of Cthulhu game on campus and then some Dark Sun and Rifts and on and on. But to me, the whole thing was, and this is back when, I think Final Fantasy 3 was out for the Super Nintendo.
Mm.
Which look, great game, but what you could do in Final Fantasy 3 versus what I could do in a tabletop game where the only limit was my imagination.
Yeah, yeah, no contest.
And that to me is the beauty of tabletop RPGs is that you really are only limited by your imagination, and it sounds like Fate really kinda takes that knob and really leans on it heavy.
Oh yeah, definitely embraces that idea. It is very good for imaginative players and GMs who really just want to, be able to play what's in their head with as little interference from mechanics and rules as possible, pretty much.
Yeah. So now let me ask you this though. You said you start the game with 3 fate points, and it is sort of a meta currency, but can you get them back in any way, or do you have to,
Yeah.
like, margin out your parse out your 3 per the whole session?
Yeah, so you can get them back, and that actually leads into like the third way for players to use fate points, which are called compels. So a compel is basically when someone else uses one of your aspects against you to like cause a problem for you. So in the Fate Core book, it talks about how a player has an aspect of manners of a goat, and so then if you're like at a ballroom party or something like that, and you have manners of a goat, the GM can be like, hey, since you have manners of a goat, I would guess that you're gonna be, gonna like really insult some people, right? Or like you're just gonna be like totally out there in terms of your decorum and stuff. And the player could be like, oh yeah, yeah, totally. So then what the GM does is he gives that player a fate point to compel the aspect, and so there's going to be now like some sort of narrative complication where that player being rude, comes into play, and the character gets the fate point in exchange for that.
Okay. So
Yeah.
essentially you get the currency for playing the thing you wrote down about your character that is not positive.
And the interesting thing with Fate is that they encourage you to try to come up with aspects that can be double sided
Mhm.
because it might not be intuitive, but even something like the manners of a goat that might be able to come in handy, like if you wanted to create a distraction for someone in order for them to be able to like steal the artifact that your party's after or something. So it takes some getting creative, but a lot of times, even if an aspect seems positive or negative on the surface, you can sort of twist that to have it be a drawback or a bonus for you. So
Yeah, well, it sounds like they really are looking to push creative thinking, which is, again, what RPGs are for.
oh yeah. So you've got this sort of meta currency flow, and basically part of being a good Fate player and Fate GM is keeping the points flowing back and forth.
Mhm.
Because those will make for the best stories generally when you have people doing awesome stuff by invoking their aspects to do really cool things with their skills and aspects and stuff, and then having the GM introduce more complications to the story so that it's sort of that yes and type of philosophy there where you're going to be doing all this stuff, but that doesn't mean there aren't going to be new complications that pop up along the way.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really intended to be a very kind of low prep, improv heavy game.
Yeah, it certainly can be. Although I do know people who do try to plan some things out, but generally because it's supposed to be so collaborative in nature and encourage this creative thinking, and it's also supposed to be very like character focused by default. So, every session should really ideally be driven by the actions and decisions made by the characters. So, it doesn't work as well if you're sort of planning everything out like you would like have a railroad where you're going to rescue the princess and defeat the demon lord and whatever like that. Like ideally the player should have the freedom to be able to decide how their characters are going to approach these challenges that are put before them, and whether or not they're going to do what's expected of them or not, or if they go in a completely different direction. Fate really gives a lot of freedom to shape the narrative that way, and so coming up with, railroads to lead people in a certain direction kind of goes against that philosophy. And so it's generally discouraged. And it's gonna get in the way of the other mechanics of playing Fate if you try to do that, I guess. So it's not that you can't do it. It's just that the system's not going to work as well because it's going to sort of oppose you because there are so many like player forward facing mechanics that allow them to shape the story.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Like, I know from my personal experience, that's when you get the most buy-in, to go back to what we were talking about last week. It's because if you're feeding off what the players are doing, they're interested because they just told you that.
exactly. That's the thing with the aspects too, by the way. If someone writes down that they're like, the member of a mystic laser sword wielding, monk group, then you know that the character is interested in leaning into that. So you're going to want to bring up things having to do with that, whether it's, someone, is trying to steal the laser sword, or, there's like some like evil person that has the same type of powers, going up against them. So just by creating your characters and making your aspects, you're sort of not only shaping the setting and the story, but you're also sort of giving like jump off points for the GM to use in sort of shaping and directing the campaign.
Yeah, what you were saying with the aspects, like it's not like, look, we've all played D&D. We all know what we mean when I say dump stat, but
Hmm.
in Fate, you get to pick your dump stat and you get to make it whatever you want it to be. It's not like, well, I have a 8 or a 6 and I got to put it somewhere.
Yeah.
That lends itself to a more engaged mode of play, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Oh yeah, for sure. Again, and I'm trying to remember if this is raw or not, but I know a lot of people who, when they're playing Fate, also between sessions, for example, they'll allow you to like switch the values of two skills. Like you're like, oh, my character didn't really work the way I thought it would. When I had, like stealth at +1 and shoot at +4. So I'm going to switch those around. I want them to be more stealthy, and I don't really care if they can shoot really well. And like that is often like just totally okay. So there's a lot of freedom there too, if you sort of just want to try to tweak things to make your character the way you want it. Now, obviously, you're switching the two things, so it's not like you're getting any extra bonuses for any particular skills. You're just sort of like changing the emphasis of the character that way. But yeah, I think that's kind of neat.
Now, that actually brings up a thought. Does Fate have any mechanism for character advancement?
Oh yeah. So they have milestones in Fate, and they sort of break it up into like minor milestones and major milestones, and so basically they give guidelines for what you can do with each thing. And it's like minor milestones I think can occur like after a given adventure. So like after you've completed that adventure, you can hit a minor milestone, and you can like switch around like two stats, for example, like I was saying, or right. So then with minor milestones, you can switch the rank values of any two skills, or you can replace one average, which is a +1. So Fate has like what's called the skill ladder, and so you can either represent a skill by their numerical bonus, like a +1, or they actually have words that go along with it. So +1 is average, and 2 is fair, 3 is good, 4 is great, and 0 is like mediocre. -1 is I'm trying to remember if it's terrible or some other word like that, but you get the idea. That
Yeah.
so you can either talk about how, oh, like I'm terrible at driving or something like that, and I'm
Mhm.
great with stealth, or you can just be like, yeah, I've got the +1 or +3. But yeah, so you can change or replace one average skill with one that isn't on the sheet instead. So if you don't have a rank in a skill, I guess you could say it's assumed that it's 0. So it's neither a plus or a minus to whatever you're trying to do with it. You only get a certain number of skills to start out with that actually have bonuses. So then if you decide like, oh, I actually would have preferred to have this skill give me a bonus because I'm using it a lot more than I thought, then you could switch it out with one that you're not using as much.
Mhm.
So then you've got significant milestones also, which is where you can sort of add points to your skills. And the interesting thing with Fate, which I think Genesis borrowed from Fate for this, is that they have the skill pyramid where you have to have basically more of a lower tier skill number in order to have, or in order to advance another skill to the higher tier. I think I said that poorly. But basically, you're going to start out with many more like +1 skills than you will like +4 skills. And in order to be able to increase those, you need to sort of build up the lower tier skills first, because you can't have more like +3 skills than you can +2 skills, etc.
Yeah, something akin to the lines of you've gotta have 2 +1 skills to get a +2 skill. You gotta have 2 +2s to get a +3, etcetera.
Yeah, and so that also helps to sort of, I wouldn't say balance. I don't think that that's the right word for it, but it sort of like helps sort of have a smoother character advancement where you can't just put everything into one stat. You kind of have to add things to other parts so that you're not just making yourself a one-trick pony.
I was going to say, I think it sounds to me like it would lend toward making a more rounded character as opposed to a hyper focused character.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, there's no reason why narratively you can't have that focus. Just like mechanically, you're also going to have these other skills that you're good at. Whether or not you choose to use them a lot is sort of up to you.
Hmm.
But yeah, but going back to what I was originally saying, yeah. So there are just like different levels of milestones. You can eventually, add aspects in potentially, or you can actually take additional points of what's called refresh, which refresh is the mechanical name for how many fate points you start out with. So by default, you have a refresh of 3 when you're starting out in a fate game by default,
Hmm.
and then that can go up or down depending on whether or not you want to use them to buy stunts, or if you decide that you're not going to do that and you just want to keep increasing the amount you start out with.
So I don't remember you covering this, but I've heard you say this stunts thing a couple times. I saw it in the book. What are stunts? Are those like feats in a D&D context?
They're sort of like a feat or talent, I guess, in something like a D20 system. But basically, they allow you to do cool things, or they allow your character to do cool things that may bend or break the rules of fate in certain instances. Like, for example, by default, I don't think you can use the stealth skill when you're attacking someone. But if you have like a backstab stunt, you could have it where, oh, you can get a +2 to stabbing someone, in the back when they're unaware of you, and you would use your stealth skill to do it. So even if you had like a low like fight skill or whatever you want to call it in your game, you could then have a character that was more stealthy that could use that skill to their advantage to do damage.
Okay.
Which I shouldn't say damage actually, because talking about weird things about fate, there is no like HP, so to speak.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that once we kind of got through the skills thing.
Yeah, we're getting there slowly, aren't we? Yeah, but was there anything else regarding these milestones or anything else like that, or do we want to keep going?
No, I think we just keep going.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, so with Fate, and this is one of the things I think is hardest for people to get used to because it's so different than almost any other RPG I can think of, is that instead of HP, you have what are called stress and consequences. And my friend and former co-host for the Powered by Fate podcast, Rob Hans, would, if he were here, he would say, stress is basically a pacing mechanism. When you're fighting or doing a combat, in like a D20 system. You're doing damage to someone's HP, and if they hit 0, then that means that, they faint or they're out or whatever. In some systems, you're dead. But ultimately, all that's really saying is that this character, can do a certain amount of stuff before the combat's over. Like characters with less HP are probably going to be able to accomplish less on average if, they're really getting attacked than someone with a lot of HP. So it really is just how do you pace out the combat. So stress is just a way of when you get hit by an attack, for example, or pretty much anything that could potentially cause your character to like stumble or whatever, you, instead of taking the full brunt of that force, so like let's say someone tries to attack you and they succeed with a margin of like +3, normally that would do like +3. Again, I don't want to say damage. I'm trying to remember what the parlance is in Fate, but
Is it the physical stress or mental
yeah,
stress?
yeah. You can have both physical and mental stress, yeah, and those can actually be modified by certain skills by default. So I think it's physique gives you extra stress points or stress slots, and then willpower, I think, or will is what gives you the extra mental stress slots. But so yeah, instead of taking the full damage, you could say like, oh, I'm going to use up my 2 stress skill slot. Or sorry, I'm saying this wrong. You would so yeah, let's say you have a margin of 2 against you, like the enemy attacks, they beat your defense roll by 2. You would have a slot of 2 because it sort of goes like a 3 2 1. So like each box represents 3 2 1 stress. So then you could cross off your 2 stress box in order to basically negate that damage. So nothing mechanically bad is happening to your character, even though narratively, they might be getting the crap kicked out of them. And so that's what I mean when it's a pacing mechanism, is that, the fight can basically keep going until you run out of stress or you start taking consequences and you don't want to get more hurt. And so when you can't block the amount of, I'm just going to say damage because it's easier for people to understand. But yeah, so like if you can't block the amount of damage fully that's being done to you, that instead would get taken up by a consequence. And you can have different levels of consequences that can negate certain amounts of damage. So I think a minor consequence can take care of like 2, and then like a moderate takes care of 4, and a major consequence could take care of 6. And then they have what's called an extreme consequence, which often doesn't get used at all, but there could be some situations where it would. But often, like once you get the high, you're like losing an arm or something like that. But yeah, so a consequence will be like a little narrative thing. So you cross it off, and then you put a narrative thing that says like what consequence happened as a result of this attack. So in the case of like a minor consequence, it might be like, oh, I stubbed my toe or something like that. Moderate could be like, oh, they, sliced me a bit with their knife. And then like a major thing could be like they totally bashed in my skull or something like that. And now I've got a huge concussion and I'm bleeding and et cetera, et cetera. But basically, once you run out of things to take consequences of other stuff with, you're basically out of the fight. Or in some situations, if it makes sense narratively and the player and everyone is cool with it, you could die potentially. Sorry, I know that was a lot to process.
No, no, no. I'm listening. Yeah. It just
It's hard to explain, I think, especially like if you don't have the book in front of you and you've never played it before. I think it makes a lot more sense when you actually experience a game of Fate and you see how all of these things play at the table.
Yeah, well, what I'm kind of hearing though is it's not a game about, and this is where we said it way back when we started, is it's not a game about if you want the crunch of the numbers and everything. It almost sounds like Fate is intended to be played. You fight until the fight is narratively over, until you have a narratively satisfying end to the conflict, and then it's done because we aren't going to worry about you ran out of hit points, so now we're done. No,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's much more intended as a narrative vehicle than any sort of simulation, which is, I think, what war games came out of, which is where D&D and a lot of traditional, if you will, RPGs have their roots, even though some have advanced significantly.
Right, right. Yeah. So just to circle back real quick, and I'll try to keep this brief, but so tying all of what I just said back into this idea that the stress and the other stuff are pacing mechanisms. Like let's say your enemy has a grenade launcher. Now obviously like, one explosion from a grenade launcher is generally enough to kill pretty much any normal person, right? So narratively, it makes sense that unless you're taking like a major consequence or dying or something, you're not going to be hit by those grenades when the enemy is shooting at you, right? You might have to like dodge out of the way, or you might get knocked over from like the edge of the blast or something, but you're not necessarily going to like actually get caught up in the explosion. But you can still in Fate take stress because of the attack, like because the enemy did like +2 or +4 more than you were able to defend. You're gonna like mark off that stress, and so you're closer to potentially like being out of the fight. But narratively, you haven't actually taken any major damage. So it kind of like mirrors what you see a lot in like cinema, right? Where it's sort of like you can have like this long sword fight, and people get tired and they can like get their jabs in, but the fight is never really over until you have like that final, like you force someone against the pole, and you tell them that you're their father, and chop off their arm, right? And then you drop down and get sucked into the air filtration. But so exactly though, right? So the fight keeps going, even though in that situation, like Luke Skywalker would be taking stress during the fight. He doesn't actually get any like major injuries until he loses his hand. And in Fate, I could imagine that would be represented by, oh, okay, well, he used up all of his stress boxes in this fight, blocking these attacks. And now he's not able to block this big one. And so now he's taking, this like extreme consequence of, chopped off arm. And obviously, some consequences, it'll make sense that you can't really heal back to 100%. But for other things like a broken leg, you can eventually work it down from like a major consequence to a moderate and to a minor. And those narrative descriptions for the consequences actually act as aspects on their own. So those can actually be used by enemies or the GM, sort of like meta to create problems for you. Like, oh, you're trying to run away from these people, but you've got a broken leg. So obviously, going to be a little bit of a setback for you. So, you're going to, these other people are going to get a +2 when they invoke or when they compel that to their rolls trying to catch you, if that makes sense. Because in Fate, in Fate, you don't really ever subtract. For the most part, you always add. Instead of subtracting from your roll, you would add to the opponent's roll. It's a really cool idea, just because everything in Fate you can basically turn into an aspect, and then so you can have the narrative and the mechanical components to that.
Yeah, I've never played it. I don't think I've ever read a game, but this sounds interesting, even if it's only just for goofy one-shots. I mean, it seems like it's almost tailor-made for that. Do you have any experience playing, like, a longer campaign in Fate and how well that functions, or
So I myself have never run a really long campaign with it, but I do know plenty of people who have. And I think it's just all about what the group's trying to do. And as long as everyone's having fun and you've sort of got a narrative that you want to develop, you could basically keep it going as long as you wanted. I mean, Fate, like you've sort of been saying yourself, is all about, coming up with like the narrative to the story, and so you basically have the final say over when the story's over, so you can do it like you could have like season arcs almost and like keep it going that way. Or you can say like, okay, you've got like this one goal of we're going to go rescue the princess or whatever and defeat the demon lord. And then once you get to that point, then it's over and we're not, the campaign's over. We can play something else or start a new campaign or whatever.
yeah, but I mean, like, in the context that you've got, if you get the Fate core book, you bought one book, you can use it to play a zillion different things.
Oh yeah, and then I think I mentioned also like they've got a bunch of different toolkits and other things that are like supplements that you can get. Like they have the horror one that I mentioned that sort of gives ideas for how to tweak mechanics to make it do horror better.
Mhm.
So sort of ways of like weakening the characters or sort of balancing things out to make it scarier for them.
Mhm.
They've also got a space toolkit, which is like really great for like running sci-fi and things like that. So they talk about how to add in mechanics that help to reflect the sci-fi genre better. And so that's one of the cool things I like about Fate actually is that they I'd say Cortex kind of does this too with their mods and things like that, but they come up with mechanics that reinforce the genre and the feel that you're trying to go for.
Mhm.
And that's why I think with both Fate and Cortex, like you can play a Fate game in horror and you can play a Fate game in sci-fi, and they may feel completely different. They may use a lot of the same mechanics, but they've got, differences that are specifically targeted towards, emulating that genre almost, I guess.
Yeah, well, it almost sounds like maybe I don't know, maybe I'm completely off base here, but it sounds like Cortex is almost a very, very expanded version of Fate with values placed on things outside of just 1 through 4, and I don't know that that's a fair comparison, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it almost sounds like Cortex Prime took Fate and just went, "Let's blow it up."
Well, I think even before Cortex Prime, there were a lot of mechanics with the various Cortex games that I think were probably inspired by Fate. And I know that Cam Banks, who is the creator of the Cortex Prime system, a few years ago I'm trying to remember what it's called, but it was a game that was basically a combination almost of like Fate and Cortex, if that makes sense. So they were like elements from both of those sort of put into one. And so I think he, in particular, is very familiar with both Fate and Cortex. And I can definitely see some influence in Cortex from Fate. And I can also see some things that are similar, similar to things that happen in Cortex and Fate too. But I think Fate basically came first. So it's probably more that direction where Fate influenced Cortex than the other way around. I wouldn't say that it's like an exact copy or even just like Fate Plus, because there are things that they do really different, and for example, Cortex, you can sort of have hit points if you want as a mod and stuff like that, which I guess with Fate you could also add in hit points, but it's really not as easy to do that. But point being, they are very similar in some ways and very different in others, but I think that they both try to go for that narrative, trying to emulate various types of narratives and genres sort of thing,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
that makes sense.
No, and like I said, I know that came out weird the way I said it, but I meant it, like, complimentary in both regards. You know what I mean?
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think Cam Banks or Fred Hicks, who are both, like lead people for Cortex and Fate respectively, would be insulted by the comparison to each other's systems at all. I think that they both have similar goals, I think.
Let's be honest, there's only so many original ideas in the world, you know? It's the
Yeah.
whole principle behind science and technology is you take this thing that someone else did and build on it, and game design's no different.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I'm trying to think then. I've covered a lot of stuff about Fate. Was there anything left unclear so far, or was there anything else you wanted to know?
No, I mean, I think that's and I mean, look, if you're out there listening and going, "Well, what can you play in Fate?" Look, go to Drive Through RPG, and the box on the left side of the window, there's this little box that says Rule System. Go down to Fate, and there's literally hundreds of products.
Yeah, and I should actually mention that Evil Hat, which is the company behind Fate, actually makes a bunch of pay what you want like settings or like
Mhm.
not even settings, they're almost like mini games for Fate, which the general goal is to tweak certain rules or add in certain like mini systems to supplement Fate. And so you get these really cool Fate games that all function differently from each other, but they've got one's called Secrets of Cats, and you play as like a cat that is protecting your neighborhood from like supernatural evil.
Okay, that's where that Cats of Gravity Falls came from then.
Okay, they may have been using Secrets of Cats, yeah. And they have one called Ghost Planet, where it's like you're playing sort of like astronauts that are investigating various planets around the galaxy. And like basically the premise is that like humans have started discovering like ruins of ancient alien civilizations, but they've never met live aliens. And it seems like every alien civilization they find was destroyed in some sort of disaster, and it looks like they may all have been connected in some way. So like you're going and exploring and trying to figure out like why aren't there any other intelligent beings in the galaxy? And you're running into like robot assassins left behind by these civilizations, or sort of like falling into traps or things like that, or the alien civilization was gone, but these like animal monster things that live there have continued to survive. So just like cool stuff like that. So there's just a lot of different things. They have one that's like Three Musketeers, but with jetpacks. Um, they have one where it's like King Arthur, but with mechas. I don't know. They just do a lot of cool, crazy things. They have one where it's called Uranium Chef, and it's literally like a cooking show game, like a really bizarre, wacky cooking show game.
I actually just saw that a few minutes ago.
Okay, yeah.
That yeah,
So
that got added to the wish list.
yeah, man, I could just keep listing off things. They have like Wild West with zombies. I forget what that one's called. People are probably going to be screaming if they're familiar with Fate, like you should know the name of this game, But
I just scrolled down to the bottom of the page on drive through with the search parameters set to the Fate rule set. They're showing 950 items.
yeah, I mean there is a lot of stuff being done, and that has been done with the Fate system.
Yeah, and I'm sure if you went on, like Itch, there's probably even more that aren't on drive through, and Lord knows how many are just out there floating around, be it Reddit or wherever.
Yeah, I mean, because it's so easy to just create your own world and setting, right? And then it's also pretty easy to add in your own mods or hacks. People can use it fairly easily to do sort of like I wouldn't say like rules light game, but like there's very like minimal stuff that you would have to include in order to allow other people to play in your setting or like with your house rules.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I would say I would probably characterize Fate as like a rules medium game, but again, like we talked about earlier in the episode, it's not really like number crunch. It's
Mhm.
just more of the various mechanics that they use to enhance the narrative that you have to sort of wrap your head around.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
fair. So, anything more you want to say on Fate?
Oh man, I love Fate. I love a lot of games, but Fate definitely has a special place in my heart because when I started looking into role-playing games beyond like West End games Star Wars or Dungeons and Dragons, I realized that I wanted something that was more story focused because that's just sort of the types of games I prefer to play are the ones focused on story. And I just had run into Fate as like one of the major contenders for that genre or game type. And so I had, gotten the pay what you want version and read through it and I said, wow, this could like literally do anything I wanted. And, it's so open to just using your creativity and imagination to make things happen that it's right up my alley. So I guess what I would say is I encourage anyone who really enjoys, narratives and stories and cares more about that than keeping track of, how many of whatever item you have or having to know like how many hit points you lost in the last battle or whatever. Give it a try. You may find that it's right up your alley too and exactly what you're looking for. And check out Cortex. I have to say that because, that's my current role playing game and I don't want to pretend like I don't love Cortex also.
Oh, you know what? I said this when Kirby was on. Cortex, I think, is a game that is worth picking up to read, even if all you're going to do for from it is borrow things, because it feels like it's got a lot of really great ideas that even if you aren't going to use Cortex as Cortex, you can take a lot from it to make your other games better, or you could just play it as it is.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, the fact that it's so modular means that you could always take pieces that you like and incorporate it into another system or your own game, homebrew, or whatever, without too much difficulty, I'd say.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think with that, do we wanna do game of the week?
Sure, we can do game of the week.
Game of the week. Game of the week.
Is it okay if my game has nothing to do with anything we just talked about?
Absolutely.
Okay. I don't know if it's ever been mentioned on your show because I didn't look at a list or anything, but has anyone brought up Simbaroom before?
No, we have not. Have brought up
Okay.
stuff from Free League, but not Symbaroum.
Okay. Yeah. So
Which version are you talking about?
So I'm talking about like the original version non 5e Symbaroum game, which was originally published by a Swedish company called Yarnringen, but they got bought up by Free League, and so now it's a Free League title. And the
Mhm.
people who worked for that smaller company are now working for Free League, so it's not
Yes.
a happy ending to that story. Sometimes the companies go under and then everyone's unemployed, but this worked out. But I digress. So, Symbaroum is a dark fantasy game, and one of the best ways to pitch it, I think, is sort of like Princess Mononoke meets Game of Thrones.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if you're familiar with both or either of those titles, but
Not so much, although I am mildly familiar with Symbaroum.
okay, fair enough. So, the premise of Symbaroum is that there are these humans from a land to the south that just fought in this war against necromancers, and their land has basically died. So they migrate north into this other land and start like trying to resettle there. And in this new land to the north, there's this huge, gigantic forest that basically, if you look at a map of it, covers like at least three quarters or seven eighths of the region. And so this huge forest is called Davokar.
Mhm.
And apparently, what the lore says happened is that there used to be this really powerful, almost like ancient Rome analog, and they had all this like powerful magic, and suddenly they just sort of seemed to their empire collapsed, and in its place, like almost overnight, grew up this huge forest, and this forest has like this sort of corruption about it that comes from all this crazy magic that they used to do. And so basically, people sort of go into the forest at their own risk, but there are all sorts of ancient treasures and things there. But you can risk basically getting corrupted, and then you can like turn into like a monster or whatever. You've got a bunch of different factions, which is where the Game of Thrones stuff comes in, right? So you've got like elves who sort of like protect the forest and try to keep people out of it. You've got dwarves that sort of keep to themselves in the mountains. You've got these humans that they call barbarians, which they sort of just like live in tribal villages, and they're afraid of the forest, and they have these like taboos against it. And there's a whole sort of theme of imperialism and other stuff going in, because like this new group of people is sort of like starting to displace these original natives to the land. And so it just gets really interesting with the political and social nature of it. And of course, you're doing the traditional like go adventuring into the dangerous place to get the treasure thing too.
Yeah, yeah. No, I've heard a decent amount about this through another
Yeah.
podcast I listened to. If I'm not mistaken, aren't all the roles completely player facing as well?
Yes, yes, that's one of the big things that I really enjoyed about it, was that sometimes, especially like when I'm GMing, I don't want to have to worry about doing a bunch of rolls and keeping track of this NPC rolled this or that. So everything in Symbaroum is all player-facing rolls. So they're both rolling to attack and to dodge instead of you rolling to attack them. Everything is done with D20 basically, and your attributes act as modifiers to that d20, and you're basically doing a roll under. So like if you have a stat of 10 for one of your stats, then you're going to try to roll a 10 or under in order to succeed when that stat comes into play. And so it's just very simple, very quick. Everything is like really streamlined. So like in earlier versions of Dungeons and Dragons, like I'm thinking specifically maybe like 3.5 and 4.2, I guess, like encounters could take a while. With Symbaroum, because everything's so player facing, and it's like the enemies like have set damage that they do if they strike a hit and stuff like that, everything just goes really quickly, and it's almost all narrative on the GM's part. So it's really great for the GM who doesn't want to have to prep a whole lot, because you can just focus on telling the story instead of having to worry about doing rolls and other stuff.
Yeah, and I believe don't they have a big like mega campaign that they're releasing, or maybe they finally got it all out now?
No, they haven't finished it. There is a big mega campaign though. It's called the Throne of Thorns campaign, and so they actually have like a quick start that sort of sets the stage for it too. So even like from the very beginning, you've got this like free quick start that sort of acts like a prequel, and they've got this whole huge mega campaign where they've come out with like chapters, and these are like basically like source book long chapters and adventures. And so each new chapter focuses on a different part of the setting in Symbaroum.
Okay, so they're kind of doing the source book slash adventure module in one.
Yeah, and it works out pretty well, I think. So like you get to also use the information. Like you could buy this campaign and never play it. You could just buy it because one of them will talk about Thistlehold, which is like the village right outside of the forest of Davokar that most people pass through before going into the forest. And then another one talks about like this barbarian camp. That's like right inside the forest. And then another one talks about the capital city of these humans that came from the south and like resettled. And so you get to learn about that too, and it's like this big city. So just all these different elements playing together.
No, that's a game I'm not a big fantasy person in general, but Simram has been one that I'm kind of keep looking at and going, "Ooh, I want to."
It's just a really cool setting, and I just have a lot of fun with the mechanics too, just because it's so straightforward and quick.
Mhm.
So, hey, maybe I'll run it for you one of these days. Who knows?
Ooh.
Just adding to the list, we've got, let's see now, we've got Cortex, Fate, Symbaroum.
The
But yeah,
the list of games I want to play slash run is extremely long.
fair. Me too. But yeah, so that was my game of the week, I guess.
Okay. Well, I was going to go in the spirit of things just because, well, I don't know, I'm one of the hosts. I can do what I want, right? I found a Fate game that I think just looks like it could be fun. I found Mecha versus Kaiju.
Oh yeah, I know about that one.
I mean, like, let's be honest, especially if you're playing it narratively, what's more fun than great big giant monsters and really big robots?
Yeah,
I mean,
it definitely scratches an itch, I think.
what more do you need to say?
Yeah.
And what I found out too, though, the main volume, the PDF's $10, right? So, I mean, it's not bad, but there's a whole ton of like $2 and $3 kind of like supplements or whatever for it that the same people have put out, and it just looks like it just looks like it could be an incredibly fun thing to do for 2 or 3 sessions, or even longer if you really wanted to, or like you said, do it kind of a season thing where you do these characters for a while and then maybe you pick it up, a little bit later and you're still playing in the same world but different characters or any number of things. But I mean, the pitch for the game is born in nuclear fire, the kaiju stride across the face of the world, unstoppable. Only one power can hope to match these giant monsters, the Mecha Assault Force. And so you become a pilot of these mecha, and you build, and of course it's got a heavy anime influence and so on
Yeah,
and so
sure.
forth. But yeah, it just, I mean, I'm sorry. The title says it all. What more do you need to know?
Yeah, Mecha versus Kaiju. Yeah, and it's also, you don't need a huge budget for the Michael Bay explosions either, because it's all in your imagination. So there you go.
Exactly, exactly. So I wish I could be more wordy about this, but I don't think I need to.
Yeah, don't worry. I was wordy enough with Simbaroom for the both of us, so it's all good.
Alrighty. So I guess that's what I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come on and talk with us. And I know Steve wishes he could have been here tonight, but the internet gods decreed otherwise.
Yeah, I'm sorry he couldn't join us either.
But where can people find, be it Prime by Cortex? And I know you do some writing for the D20 blog as well.
Yeah, I've sort of stepped down from that for now, actually, since I've been a bit busy. I just haven't been able to really keep up with it and do it justice. But yeah, I've got a bunch of articles on there that people can go and read. So yeah, on d20radio.com, if you just go down to authors, my name's on there. You can check out stuff that I write. I just write about a whole lot of different RPG stuff. I don't really have a particular shtick. Just kind of like whatever popped into my mind is what I wrote. In terms of like other social media stuff, I'm on Facebook all the time, pretty much. I am the community manager for the D20 Radio in its various social media forums. So I'm sort of moderating the Facebook group. I basically run the Discord group for D20 Radio, which you can find a link to that in the D20 Radio website and Facebook group as well.
Mhm.
I actually made a little group that a lot of people don't know about, but it's actually called Looking for Gamers, which is a D20 Radio associated group. And I had originally made it with the intention of allowing people on Facebook to plan online games with other people in the D20 Radio network. But of course, since other things have come out now, like Discord and other stuff like that, people haven't been really using it as much, but that's there if people want it. I have a Twitter account at JT Dimino, and that's it. So just my name. I don't really use it a lot, but if you were to tweet at me or something, I get a notification and I'll respond. But for Primed by Cortex, which is sort of the bigger social media thing, and we're a bit more active with that. For Primed by Cortex, we have an email, which is pbcpodcast at d20radio.com. We've got Primed by Cortex Facebook group. We have our own channel in the D20 Radio. We haven't made our own Discord because we haven't really felt the need to do that with our fan base yet, but that's there. And also, Kirby and I like to hang out on the official Cortex Discord, which you can find a link to at cortexrpg.com. And people like that are on the staff and the creative teams are there. Like Cam Banks himself frequents there, and you can ask him questions or see what he's up to. But yeah, I mean, I'm around. Especially if you look up anything D20 radio related, you'll probably find me. So if you want to get a hold of me, you'll be able to find me.
Yes, JT is everywhere.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we'll put all those links down in the show notes and so on and so forth for the episode. I think with that, if you want to get a hold of us here at Me and Steve, I don't remember the email address, but I know it's in the show notes. On Twitter, it's at and RPGs. Facebook, I believe it's Me and Steve RPG Podcast. but I know it's linked in the show notes. We do have our own Discord server, in addition to a channel on the D20 Discord server that JT was talking about. You can find me there a lot. The other Steve, he's around. He doesn't post as much as I do, but that's because I'm a bad person and get on Discord all the time while I'm supposed to be working.
My lips are sealed.
Yes, I won't tell anyone on the internet if you don't. All right. Well, I think with that, then, it's time to remind you to be kind to each other and go play some RPGs.
Thanks for having me. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Intro and outro music by the band 12 Noon. You can email us at meandsteverpg@gmail.com. You can also find us at facebook.com/meandsteverpg. Thank you, and be kind to each other.
How much for the cigar?
Cigar, $20, dog. You gotta go down the street to the store and buy that.